In the podcast today, we honor the work and life of Robert Redford, who died in September. He made a lot of good films, including, in my opinion, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which was the first movie I ever saw in a theater. I think I can safely trace my lifelong love of movies back to that first experience. Robert Redford also had a lifelong love affair with movies, and he put his energy and passion into building the Sundance Film Festival, which helped to strengthen independent filmmaking in this country. We have Sundance to thank for Steven Soderbergh, Quentin Tarantino, Ryan Coogler, Robert Rodriguez, Chloe Zhao, and Ava DuVernay, among many others. Independent American film still struggles, while blockbuster Hollywood still prevails, but every once in a while, something remarkable gets made by an unknown on a shoestring budget. We have Mr. Redford to thank for that. So, let's get to it.
Hello and welcome to Woman Inherits the Earth, a mother-daughter podcast about the representation of women in movies and television. I am Tess Adair, a writer and the author of the paranormal mystery series The Karanzan Chronicles and Beth's daughter.
And I am Beth Von Baron, Tessa's mother and also a writer. In the podcast today, we are discussing The Sting, a film from 1973. It is 129 minutes long, directed by George Roy Hill, who I think also directed Butch Cassidy, produced by Richard D. Zanuck of the Zanuck family for Universal Pictures. Written by David S. Ward, costumes by Edith Head, color by Technicolor. These are important things in the style of film, so I'm mentioning them. Starring Paul Newman, Robert Redford, and Robert Shaw, all of whom have now left the building. Also starring Charles Durning, Ray Walston, one of my favorite actors, Eileen Brennan, one of my favorite actresses, Harold Gould, and Robert Earl Jones, who is the father of James Earl Jones. These are familiar names and faces to me because they're mostly character actors of the 1960s, 70s, and sometimes some of them into the 80s. Ray Walston played the Martian in My Favorite Martian. There are two women with significant roles in this film. We'll talk about that a little bit. Robert Shaw is, of course, familiar to many of us from his starring role 2 years later in Jaws. He actually died in 1978 at the age of 51. He was pretty young, died of a heart attack.
Did not realize that until you just said it, but as you said it, it totally clicked for me. That's what
it clicked for
okay.
You knew you'd seen him somewhere. Yeah.
Yep. I gotta say also, his Irish accent in this movie is the weirdest Irish accent I've ever heard on screen.
You know what, though? It's real. He's Irish. He's from Ireland.
He's not Irish, but he did die in Ireland. I looked him up. He's
he
English.
Lives in Ireland.
He did live in Ireland, yes, which just makes it all the weirder that it was such an odd accent.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yeah.
All right. So here's a quick summary. This is an American caper film in the style of 1930s gangster films about two con men, Gondorff and Hooker, conning a criminal mob boss, for lack of a better way to describe this guy, Lonigan, who's played by Shaw, out of $500,000. Hooker pulls off a small con, robbing Lonigan of $11,000 with the help of his friend Luther, and Lonigan demands satisfaction for the insult by killing Luther and trying to find and kill Hooker as well. After Luther is killed, Hooker wants to get revenge by pulling off a complicated con to both rob Lonigan and do it in a way that he doesn't know he was robbed, because there would be repercussions. Set in 1936 against the backdrop of the Great Depression, the con involves the quick construction of an elaborate but fake gambling salon in a kind of play within a play. There's a twisty subplot where Lonigan is trying to kill the small-time grifter who robbed him of that $11,000, totally unaware that the grifter he's trying to kill is Hooker, the one he's doing business with. Hooker outruns the hoodlums, trying to kill him on several occasions. Gondorff figures out something's up and hires someone to protect Hooker, saving him from being killed by a professional hit woman after he spends the night with her, which is an interesting twist in the film.
You don't know initially when she gets hired that it's a woman.
Yeah, and they keep it, you see gloves and you see hands and guns, and they keep it unknown until she actually is about to try to kill him. They do pull off the con and walk off into the sunset together, which actually is just an alley. The screenplay was inspired by real-life cons perpetrated by brothers Fred and Charlie Gondorf and documented by David Moorer in his 1940 book, The Big Con, A Story of the Confidence Man. So that's my summary. I love this film. Tess has a much more complicated opinion about it. I actually saw this as a teenager, probably in the late 70s. It was a couple years after it was released. So the original time I saw it was later in the 70s. I've seen it a couple times since then, and it's always been in my memory, a film that I just loved. But it's hard to not like Newman and Redford. And also, it was just I think the first time I saw it, I didn't quite grasp completely how the con worked. And the second time I saw it, it was like, oh yeah, that's how they did that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That reminded me, I wanted to mention, so the con is called The Wire. That's like the name of the con. And apparently, I watched it with my partner and he recognized that as like a real type of con. It's basically when you fake a radio broadcast as part of the con. Yeah. And that is what they're doing. That's how they're doing the fake horse racing, is with a fake radio announcement.
And they've got ticker-tape announcements coming from wherever the horse races are happening. These are all bets placed on horse racing. Which was a big thing in the 30s. It's set in Chicago, so Chicago is kind of memorialized as the home of the gangster world during Prohibition, which is when gangs kind of bootleggers became gangsters, and Al Capone and all those kind of all those kind of people were making gobs of money that was not taxable, and actually that's what ended up getting Al Capone in prison. Is he never paid taxes because what he was doing was illegal, so he wasn't reporting it. So to me, it's a really stylized film. I love the style of this, and actually, I read a little bit about what some of the reviewers said at the time. Siskel and Ebert loved the film. They thought it was a very stylish film. It has a Saturday Evening Post kind of look to it, with title cards separating the sections of the story: the setup, the hook, the tail, the wire, the shutout, the sting. And those are all done like Saturday Evening Post pages, plus the Technicolor red and yellow tones, which Tess may not have liked because you have some issues with yellow tones in film.
I did think that the film was very brown, and so did my partner. He actually was the first one to point it out. I was just sort of accepting it as part of the this is just what they decided that the 1930s looked like. But my partner kept being like, why is it so brown?
It's a Technicolor film, and it was like an overly rich or overly flushed out look of color. And I want to say it started in the early 60s and went through the early 70s, and then it just kind of went out of fashion. Yeah. But I think it was like they, up until the 1950s, most films were black and white. And when they went to color, they didn't just go to color, they really went to color.
They went to really bright colors, yeah.
Really gushy colors, and then what's the word I want? Exaggerated
saturated.
That's the word I want. Oversaturated colors. And that lasted for about 10 to 15 years.
The best way to the best Technicolor films to watch are kind of the old Elvis films. They're really, really colorful. A lot of reds, a lot of just really overly saturated colors. Because, Elvis is, when Elvis was a young man, he's, a very vibrant personality. So those films really amp it up a lot.
I kind of think that Hitchcock used it a few times. And I want to say North by Northwest, but you recently saw that. Was that in Technicolor?
I mean, I think it might have been, but I wouldn't say that it's like a prime example. It's not like a particularly colorful film.
Okay.
Maybe Vertigo, because Vertigo I remember being very colorful with his little hallucinatory bits. They use a lot of colors.
I haven't seen that in a while, so you're probably right. It seems to have been shot mostly on backlots with these atmospheric matte drawings in the background, and as I said, Siskel and Ebert loved it. Pauline Kael hated it, said it was claustrophobic, and that is actually a really valid criticism of the film. I get that. I love the merry-go-round. There's a merry-go-round that is, so Billy, one of the main characters, Billy, is a woman who runs a brothel. She is herself a hot prostitute, most likely, and she has a merry-go-round in her brothel, and she's also got a bar. I mean, it's just like a speakeasy kind of culture, I guess.
Yeah.
And but
I think the merry-go-round is the front, right?
It's the front of it. They have to walk in that way, and it's so out of place.
No, I mean, it's the it's like how they're laundering the brothel. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so to hide the brothel and the speakeasy. Yes,
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. But it is also just so out of place. And her Hooker, played by Paul Newman, is the
Nope.
mechanic who keeps it running.
Paul Newman is
Not Hooker.
Gondorf.
Yeah, Gondorf. Yeah, who I would call him Gandalf all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah,
Well, and also,
Gondorf.
if you cut off the two F's, just Gondor is like one of the places in Lord of the Rings.
Yes, it is.
It's a very Lord of the Rings sounding name.
But I do love the merry-go-round, and the sounds, of course, of the rumbling train tracks tell us it's probably Chicago. If you didn't know anything else, if you didn't know where it was set, you would assume.
There's also a couple of shots of the L.
Yeah, I mean, and they talked about it being in Chicago, but I'm just saying, if there was nothing else, you'd know it was Chicago because of the rumbling. And actually, the opening scene, I may be one of the best film scenes in the whole film, where there's this the opening shot is this Depression era street scene with these bums on it, and then all of a sudden there's this man walking down the street with fancy shoes and nice slacks. Nice clothing. He's an unknown man. We see him walk along the sidewalk and then walk up the stairs, and they film him from underneath walking up the stairs where he enters a betting parlor. And that is our introduction to the film, which I thought was a really good intro scene.
And then he immediately sexually harasses the first woman he encounters.
Oh,
and that's like the first bit of dialogue. So I did want to talk a little bit about the character of Luther, who is essentially the only like important black character in the film. When we first meet Robert Redford's character, whose name is Johnny Hooker, and they bill Paul Newman as the top actor, but I kind of feel like Robert Redford is more the star. Like we follow his character for more, and he's the one who has more of a motivation. And
I think
a little
it's
bit
his
more
story.
Yeah, it's kind of more his story. So I don't know if that's just because like Paul Newman had to have top billing or what.
He was just a big star at the time.
But we start off with Hooker basically pulling a small con job with his friend Luther that accidentally nets them a lot more money than they were hoping for. Where basically Luther pretends to get robbed by this guy. So that there's a third guy who I think is called Erie. Yeah, Erie. Mm-hmm. So Erie pretends to rob Luther and takes his wallet, and then Hooker stops him and gets the wallet back, and the guy that they're conning, who's the guy that we were following before from the betting parlor, comes out and witnesses it, and Luther pretends to have a very serious leg injury and then tells them that he owes people $5,000 and that he needs to get it to them by a certain period of time or they'll kill him. And this is the con, basically. So the guy who has walked in on this is the Mark, and they basically use this to steal his money. So he thinks that he's taking this guy's $5,000 and giving it to the people that he owes it to, although in reality he's planning on taking it.
Well, the question that I had about that scene, and you're going to keep explaining it, is how do they know, if they don't know how much money it is, how do they even know he has the money? So we can get back to that, but go ahead.
Basically, Hooker shows him how to hide the money on his person and has him, like, he wraps it up in a handkerchief and then shoves it down his pants, and in so doing he gets the guy to give him the envelope that he's already carrying, and basically does like a sleight of hand thing, and what he gives him back is an envelope full of useless pieces of paper.
Tissues, I think.
And then the guy runs off in a cab thinking that he's stolen $5,000 from these people, when in reality they've stolen $11,000 from him. Unbeknownst to them, they have actually essentially stolen this money from Doyle Lonigan, who is this big Irish mob boss, and he does not take kindly to this and essentially puts a hit out on them, although for some reason the third guy in the con, Erie, is like never in danger. He never acts like he's in danger.
I wonder if they didn't know that there were three. And
maybe
all they remembered that there was a black guy, and they remembered the other guy. They didn't even describe Hooker to him, so he doesn't know what Hooker looks like, which is why he never makes the connection. But he's basically making an example of them. He says, we can't allow this to stand. It's chump change to him, but he can't allow it to stand because other people would do it.
So he essentially puts a hit out on Hooker and Luther, and before they know that they split up before they know that this has happened. So Hooker Hooker finds out and is not able to get back to Luther in time, and Luther is murdered. That is essentially our impetus for the whole story, because basically Hooker decides to go after this guy because of Luther's murder. Like, in his mind, this is his revenge for what happened to Luther, which, I don't know, I will say it kind of rubbed me the wrong way immediately, because you get the opening credits and they show you a bunch of people and they don't show you Luther. And then in that first chunk of the movie, Luther is like a very important character for that period. So, I mean, first of all, I kind of immediately knew, like, okay, either he's going to somehow get summarily written out or he's going to die. Like, he's not in the main credits, so he's clearly not an important character, even though he has, in this early scene, just as much dialogue as Robert Redford.
He has as much dialogue as my favorite Martian, Ray Walston. He has probably more dialogue than him. He should have been in those opening credits, yes.
Yeah, to be honest, like, by the time I got to the end, I kind of felt like, even by the end, he was still one of the more important and memorable characters. It's really weird that he wasn't in the opening credits. It feels racist. Obviously, I can't prove it, but that feels racist to me.
An interesting and moral and charismatic character, too. And
he's a likable guy.
You'd like to know more about his story, and then he's killed, so you don't get that story.
It is sad because he basically, like, because of this windfall, he's decided he's going to retire from doing con work and is going to join, like, a friend of his doing, like, shipping or something. So he's basically like, I'm out of the game, and then they kill him. Also, as the movie proceeded and it became clear that the whole reason for this setup was to give Hooker a motivation going forward, it struck me that essentially what they did to this character was they fridged him. So fridging...
You said that before, and I didn't know what it was, and so,
yeah. So fridging, it's become a slightly more commonly used term, but it originally applied primarily to comic books, and was essentially the term for when a comic book brutally kills off a female love interest in order to motivate the hero to do some violence. So there's, I don't remember which character it is, but there's, like, literally a comic book wherein the main character's girlfriend gets murdered and chopped up and put in a fridge, and he opens the fridge and finds her, and that's what motivates him to, go on his heroic journey. And it kind of comes to stand in for a female character who basically doesn't have her own personality or her own story and essentially exists to motivate the man. So in this instance, obviously Luther is not a woman and he's not Hooker's love interest, but essentially his real function in the story is just to motivate Hooker. Like, he does not matter to the story as a character in himself. He matters as a motivation. It's a belittling thing, right? Like, and the fact that he's basically he's not literally the only black character, because he has a family, and then there's, like, very briefly one other black character in the middle of the movie who matters so little I don't even know what his character's name is. But, like, this character is essentially the only representation of minorities in this movie. And I do think that they meant for him to be a sympathetic character. Like, you are supposed to like him. So in some ways that's progressive. But also, he is a criminal and he gets killed off immediately. It's not great representation. This is a very white movie. And I was definitely struck repeatedly by this feeling of, like, well, guess it sure was nice to be a white guy during this time period, huh?
Mm-hmm. Well, and the scene with Hooker and Luther at Luther's dining room table, where they're splitting the money, and Luther's already figured out that Hooker has blown his share of the money, and he did it by gambling
very stupid way.
Stupid way, gambled the whole chunk to impress a woman, and then the guy who's running the craps table or whatever it is pushes a button to alter,
to fix it.
To fix it. So, and he knows it, and he can't do anything about it because there's a guy behind him who is carrying a gun, and he's a thug, and he'll just shoot him because they don't care. But in those moments where the two of them are at the table, who do you like more?
Luther,
Luther.
without a doubt.
So
Yeah.
much more interesting in his little bit of dialogue. You get more character development
Yeah.
than we do from Robert Redford's character in the whole movie.
Right before that scene, when Robert Redford comes over to his house, he has a brief exchange with the guy's wife, and apparently his wife also used to be a con artist. She seems like a lot of fun too, because she's just kind of like chatting about how much fun she used to have rolling guys, but you know, she doesn't do that work anymore, and then she goes off to play bingo at church in order to win some money. Between the two of them, you do sort of get much more of a feel for Luther as a character, because he's a family man who's like actually doing this to, and you know, keep in mind, this is the 1930s, this is during the Depression. There weren't necessarily a lot of straight options for work. This is a man who's doing this to support his family, whereas Hooker is just kind of a flighty young guy who, like he takes this dancer out on the town, and it's just such a weird scene because he immediately puts his entire take, $3,000. And leading up to this, when he goes to pick up the dancer, she first says she can't go out with him because she needs to do the 10 o'clock show in order to make $5. So like that puts the perspective of like how much money is worth. Her doing a whole performance was only going to pay her $5, and then he takes her to this gambling den and he puts all of his $3,000 onto one bet and loses it instantly. I was just like, why? What is even fun about that?
What is fun about gambling? I don't understand gambling to begin with, but when the woman says that she would make $5, that was probably enough to pay her rent for the month.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
He counters that with saying, "I will spend $50 on you."
Yeah,
and he never spends the $50 because he blows all 3,000 of it on the roulette. It's not craps; it's a roulette table.
Yeah, it's roulette. So, it's a roulette table. Like I know that they're going for, okay, Hooker's a gambler, but it didn't even really feel like that, because a gambler isn't going to take all of his money and put it on one thing, because best case scenario, there's a 50-50 shot that you can't gamble anymore. So like it was just like, I don't know, I didn't really get why that scene was written the way it was. It didn't feel very realistic. I do not think that is at all, and like I don't get gambling either. I'm not a gambler and I don't really see the fun of it, but I know that you don't do it that way. You start by gambling small amounts, and then you get a high off of winning small amounts.
It sets him up as a foolish young man.
Yeah, it sets him up as an idiot.
An idiot. So, you know, the whole film is about gambling. It's all a gamble. The cons are always a gamble. And these are supposed to be, I think, the characters, not necessarily Robert Shaw's character, but everybody else. You know, they represent the working man. They are honorable thieves. You know, they con people to put food on the table, not to, you know, ride in fancy train cars, rail cars, where they can, gamble with other wealthy people, which is what Robert Shaw does. When he's gambling, he cheats, and Ray Walston has one of the best lines in the film. Or he delivers the line really well. He said, They ask him how does he win? He said, well, he cheats very well. He's good at it. He cheats and he's good at it. This is a man who doesn't need to cheat. He's got banks. He's got businesses. He's got betting parlors. You know, he is doing well for himself, and still he feels the need to cheat at poker because he has to win. He has to be in
ego
control.
Thing. Yeah.
It's an ego thing. He has to win.
That's basically how the whole con works. They're basically playing on his ego the whole time. That's how they lure him in. Essentially, they have Paul Newman's character Gondorf go and play go and play poker against him and win and humiliate him, and that's like the first part of the hook to reel him in, because he's a man who is very guided by his ego. Because
Robert Shaw's character cheats, but Paul Newman's character cheats better. Is better at cheating, I should say. And he cheats in such a way as they set the cards to have 3s and 9s in them, so that Shaw's character we'll have a 3 of a kind or 4 of a kind of 9s,
Yeah.
and what's his name? Gondorf will have 3 or 4 of a kind of 3s. So he's cheating, but then Gondorf switches out the cards. You never see it. It's all sleight of hand. And he actually ends up having, what is it, a full
Jacks.
4 jacks. And so he can't very well call him out for cheating, because the only way he knows he's cheating is because he was cheating. He can't admit to that because that would be an even worse humiliation. So, yeah, that's the whole film about gambling and taking chances. This is a different era in America. I mean, it's almost 100 years ago now. We're at 2025. And it was a different world.
I mean, I do wonder if part of the reason that I couldn't really get into the movie is just because, you know, it is the year 2025 and I watch a lot of modern movies, and pacing is very different now. I found the movie to be almost interminably slow. There were just so many shots where nothing was happening. The dialogue was fairly sparse, considering. I mean, first of all, I didn't really feel like the characters were very well fleshed out. They all just sort of seemed like sketches of characters.
Yeah, I agree.
There was so much stuff in there that didn't really need to be in there. It was just so long. It was like 2 hours and 9 minutes or something, and it really feels like it could have been a 90-minute movie.
And it's an interesting conversation about pacing and style of films by era, looking at them in different eras. It seems like the movies of the 30s and 40s, the pacing was a lot faster. They were shorter films.
Yeah.
So you got a lot more crammed into films. And then we get into the era of the great American filmmakers in the late 60s and early 70s, quote unquote, great American filmmakers. It was a new film era, and we could get into film history here, but basically modern film kind of started with the French New Wave, and that influenced American filmmakers to take more risks, be more creative, take on controversial subjects.
The films in the 40s were largely following the classic Hollywood formula, which was designed to keep people entertained. And one of the big things that French New Wave did was basically say that they're not going to design every second to be entertaining. That there was basically this emergent feeling that film shouldn't just exist only to entertain and placate the audience, but should instead challenge the audience. And sometimes the way they did that was by making the film a little boring, literally.
Well, and that's kind of an interesting thing about art in general, is filmmaking in the 30s and 40s was in its infancy. And by the time it got to 50s and 60s, and of course it's a technological art form, but still by the 50s or 60s it had evolved like any art form does. Cave drawings got better. So humans tend to create these art forms, and they get better over time and more interesting. They start with simple basic paintings or formulas, and then they start to bring in ideas. So, and that's what they were doing in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. Then the 70s got the American auteur film started in the late 60s, and actually had the Monkees movie is considered what I know, it's crazy, but it's considered one of the great examples of the beginnings of American auteur work in film, which is kind of funny, but it's a
weird movie.
Anyway, so so pacing, and you're right, in today's films is very different. There's usually a lot more action and a quick, rapid dialogue in a lot of the films, and that's what you've grown up being accustomed to. I have started to become accustomed to that, but I grew up in the era when The Sting was made. The Sting worked okay for me, but there are movies that I go back and rewatch from that era, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where I think, oh my God, how did I ever like this film? And it's because I'm so accustomed to today's films and how different they are. And that doesn't mean that they're all like, have Friends type dialogue in them. I mean, what's the name of it? A Perfect Day. Was that the name of it? The Japanese film with the
Perfect
toilets?
Days. Perfect Days.
Perfect Days. Beautiful film. And the pacing was slow, but there was always something happening, even if it was something simple. There wasn't a lot of dialogue.
Yeah, and I did like that movie, but I will say, like, I found that one just much more beautiful to watch than this one. Yes. And I think part of that is because The Sting, like you said, is like largely filmed on a Hollywood lot, whereas Perfect Days was filmed in Tokyo. It's all like real shots of Tokyo, and I feel like that's just always more interesting to watch. I mean, I could probably sit there and watch an hour-long video of just a shot of a downtown landscape, you know, because it's just, it hits my brain a certain way that I can just sort of meditate with it.
And also the actor was so expressive. So he doesn't talk a lot in the film at all. There's not a lot of dialogue, but he's so expressive, and it's just, he's beautiful to watch as well as the scenery. And when he's cleaning the toilets, which is something you would not think was a particularly beautiful thing to watch someone do, it's beautiful. It's an amazingly simple and beautiful film. This film, the visuals of it are, here's a couple things about it. Did you notice the lack of extras? I didn't until I was reading about it. George Roy Hill had noticed that in gangster movies of the 1930s, there were not a lot of extras. And in fact, in most of Jimmy Cagney's films, he gets killed in the end because he's a bad guy. So he often died face down on an empty street. There's nobody around. I guess Hill studied some of those films before he made this one. So he deliberately, except for that very first scene where you're seeing the well-dressed gentleman walk past all the bums on the street, there's not a lot of extras in this film. I mean, the streets are pretty empty.
Yeah, I feel like part of the reason I didn't notice that is because there are so many characters. There's like a million characters.
Oh, yes, there are.
Who each have like one line. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I feel like I was like, because there are so many characters who are in the background at all times, I feel like I didn't notice that there weren't very many extras. But now that you're saying it, yeah, every time Robert Redford goes to the diner, there's nobody else there.
And the subplot, the Robert Redford subplot where the guy is somebody's trying to kill him all the time, that I found both annoying and yet very purposeful. I can see why they did that, because it's the thorn in their side throughout the film. They're trying to get this con accomplished, and he keeps having to run away from somebody trying to kill him. So that's the conflict that they're experiencing. But it was also kind of irritating, that it kept interrupting the basic story.
I was kind of two minds about it, because on the one hand, it was some of the best action in the movie, like the one where Robert Redford like basically parkours his way through the city to get away from the cop. Like, that's kind of one of the more fun little sequences.
That was fun. And actually his scenes when he's being chased, it's a big long chase scene that they just kind of edited into the film at different places. So
on the other hand, the film is very long, and it does make it even longer. It does kind of bring the main plot to a stop so that we can do this other thing for a while.
So the other thing I'd like to talk about in terms of the filmmaking part is the music. All right, so the music is infused throughout, the movie, is infused throughout with the piano rags of Scott Joplin. These were quote-unquote lightly adapted for the movie by Marvin Hamlish, who was a newcomer at that time. It became a really famous guy for movie music, basically. The big song in it that is played several times in this film is called The Entertainer. That was an instrumental piece that actually reached number 3 on Billboard's Top 10 list in 1974. Hamlish won an Oscar for Best Original Score and Adaptation, but many people were upset about it because he won an Oscar for somebody else's music. Yep. And there wasn't a whole lot of adapting. So it didn't really make any sense. He had a credit and he won an award for it. But Scott Joplin did get his due, because that particular year, the movie itself popularized ragtime music, which was called at the time, or actually Record World called it the classical phenomenon of the decade. And The Entertainer reached number 3 on Billboard's list. Scott Joplin was born in Texas, but he migrated north to Sedalia, Missouri. He lived there for 6 years and then moved to St. Louis for 6 years, where he wrote several rags before moving to New York. So St. Louisans kind of feel like he's a hometowner. He was never really overly successful during his lifetime. He actually also created 1 or 2 operas. I'm not really sure, but he got into ragtime operas. He kind of created the idea of a ragtime opera. And a lot of ragtime stories are Black people's stories. So he was, he was bringing that to opera. He sadly died very young from neurosyphilis in 1917 at the age of 48, I believe, and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave for 57 years. So he kind of became popular for a little bit, and then ragtime music was popular, but it was mostly white people, and Chaplin
Yeah.
was black. But the movie did this, the Sting made him famous all over again. He finally kind of got his due, and his remains were reinterred at St. Michael Cemetery in Queens. So that's his story. And the music really is one of the things that when people talk about the Sting, it's one of the big things they remember about it is the music.
And it is one of the things that drove me crazy.
It was one of the
I just if I never hear The Entertainer again, it will be too soon. They play the song over and over and over again. Please don't. I already didn't like The Entertainer very much. I find it kind of cloying and annoying. And I get that it's historically important.
Right. Yeah, that's what ragtime is.
Very,
it's a little cloying. Yeah, it's cheesy.
I already didn't like it, and then it's like the only song in the movie, and it gets played over and over and over again. And when you're already feeling like something is kind of dragging on, and then it just keeps playing this annoying melody at you again and again, it just, oh God. And then there's one point where they like slow it down, so for a second you think it's a different song, but no, it's The Entertainer again. It's just like sold down to halftime.
Well, I liked a lot of the dialogue as well. It was pretty. I found the dialogue to be witty in many places, especially between the two leads. Glad to meet you, kid. You're a real horse's ass. Newman is so cool. And the way they play off of each other, and Gondorf is showing off his card playing expertise, and he does a whole lot of cool stuff. And then all of a sudden he just drops all the cards. That's a famous scene. And the look on Robert Redford's face was so perfect.
Yeah.
So
and they have great chemistry, and
they do.
We've touched on it a little bit, but this this came out after Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which they are both
4 years
the
later
stars of. Yeah. And they have great chemistry in that film too. I think both of these films are very buoyed by their performances and their chemistry together. You know, they really feel like they are on the same page, and in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid particularly, they feel like they've been friends for a very long time. It feels like a lived-in friendship. This film has a bit of a different setup where they didn't really know each other before. Hooker finds Gondorf because he was a friend of Luther. And to be honest, I kind of feel like this film, to me, suffered for that. I sort of wish that it hadn't been that they were meeting for the first time. I wish that it had instead been that they had been friends for a long time, because I feel like that is a big part of the appeal for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to me.
Yeah.
Their friendship and kind of their mutual self-destruction in that movie. Though they still have the chemistry here, the setup is just totally different. And to me, part of what this film is lacking is an emotional core. You know, they basically have the fridging of Luther as the only real emotional core, and I find that kind of offensive.
Well, Luther is the emotional core, and he has such a short role, and his being, like you said, the way he's the emotional core is he gets killed. So the only black person in the film gets killed off pretty early in the film. But in
order to motivate the actual important white characters.
What? Yep, exactly. Yeah. And the other thing about this is, in time-wise, it's made in 1973. So The Godfather was released in 1972, and Jaws was released in 1975. So it's kind of in the middle there. And boy, completely different from those two films. I feel like The Godfather and Jaws were the direction that film was heading in. You know, that just a more physical, realistic, edgy film. And this is not an edgy film. I mean, people do get killed in it, but it's almost a whimsical film. And it's kind of a throwback.
I gotta say, I feel like the fact that I'm supposed to take this as a whimsical film is also a problem for me, because again, it starts with the murder of a black man, and I'm just not supposed to take that seriously.
The tragedy at the beginning, and they do use the N-word at least 3 times.
Repeatedly, at least 3 times,
Which was true for the era. It was true for the era, the 30s.
Sure, but it still is really hard to hear as a modern person.
It is really hard to hear.
Yeah, especially in a movie where the black guy is then summarily killed off so that the real action can begin. I understand what they were going for, and this is the thing. I think fridging is a problem in terms of representation, but I also think it is a writing problem. It is often there as basically a lazy way to supply a motivation for a character instead of doing the harder work of writing a more complex one, you know?
Yeah, we don't know anything about Hooker. We don't know anything about either one of them. Well, how did they get to this point?
Yeah, we know they're both con men, and we know Hooker has a cartoonish gambling problem. And apart from that, we don't know anything about them. And this, I think, is part of why I like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid a bit better, because at least you know that they're friends and they've been friends for a really long time. And that's it's a much easier connection to be invested in. It feels like the only friendship in this one that I would be invested in is Hooker's and Luther's dead. So there's nothing there for me to be as invested in.
Whenever there's a story about con men or grifters or people who basically make their living illegally, it can be hard to know who to root for. Yeah, because you've got, they're kind of bad guys because they steal money. They con people out of money. But Lonigan is a much worse bad guy.
Is a monster. Yeah,
he actually kills people without giving it any thought. Just kills them.
Yeah.
So there's clearly, a demarcation here in morality, but at the same time, they are all breaking the law. I don't always enjoy movies about grifters. I like The Sting a lot. It's always been a favorite film, and I'm okay with it. I don't like what they do with Luther, but I do love all the different character actors, and there's just a lot of things about it I really enjoy. I don't think it's a great film. It's not as good as Jaws.
It was the most Oscar-winning movie of the year, though. 1973. It won 7 Oscars, which is kind of wild now.
But it's a story of a big game grift, but it's also a story about loyalty and trust. So their loyalty is to Luther, which is admirable because he is a black man and they are white men. And this is not, they were able to come together and develop a friendship with a black man, and it's basically a socioeconomic thing. They're all at the low end of the economy. They're barely getting by, and that's how they bond with each other, which is a message in some ways that black and white people who are at each other's throats and fighting each other really need to understand that they're in the same situation, and these guys have figured that one out. That is one thing I do give the film, is they understand they have to work together to overcome the mob bosses of the world.
I do agree, but I also kind of feel like we are currently living through a world that has seen the shortcomings of a politic that is willing to admit that, white people, poor white people and poor black people have a lot in common, as long as poor white people come first and are more important in the narrative. I agree. I think they're trying to be progressive. I think that's why Luther is in the film. I think, that's why he's written to be a really likable character.
Yeah.
I just think that it's very telling that he is ultimately the least important character in the film. He doesn't even make it into the main credits, and I feel like this is the kind of film that white guys are nostalgic about because it's still about them. The ultimate shortcoming here is, can we really have solidarity if our solidarity requires that we still center white men all the fucking time, to the point where the only black character is killed off and doesn't even make it into the main credits, I think they're trying to be progressive, and I think it's telling how short they fall in terms of that progressivism.
Well, and that actually brings up another point of discussion, possibly, that there just weren't that many roles for or films about black people up until actually the mid to late 70s, and then you had Shaft, and there was a slew of blaxploitation quote unquote films. I've never understood that term, because these are films about blacks. Why was it blaxploitation? And maybe
I think they tended to be really salacious. They tended to be more violent and more sexualized than a lot
that
of
makes sense. Yeah,
more mainstream films. Yeah, and a lot of them were a lot lower budget too, which is basically how they were able to make them, and to this day, you don't have to pay a black person as much as you pay a white person because of
unless you're Denzel.
Structural racism. Yeah, I mean, sure, there are certain
exceptions,
Yeah, there are always exceptions, but there are also some like incredibly well-known black actors who find out way later that they were way underpaid.
Oh yeah. Well, and then there's, and if you look a little bit further back, there's Sidney Poitier, who was like this huge exception to all of this. He not only made a lot of films in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, he made good films. And he had films where his character actually faced and fought racism in the 60s. It's pretty wild when you think about it. He was really an exception, and it's like, but then there was nothing else. There was nobody else.
Yeah, there was nobody else. We're allowed. I mean, this is where we get the
we're allowed one
token, right? Yeah, the token black person. Sidney Poitier was essentially Hollywood's token black man for a while.
He was. He totally was.
And
like,
and part of the problem with that. Yeah, no, for sure. An incredible actor. But like part of the reason that that's a problem is because we point to that person to kind of make ourselves feel better. That's our proof that actually we are allowing black people
success. You got Sydney.
But we're not. We're not, because then every single role for a black person goes to that one person and no one else can break in.
And that's true with women too. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Do we want to talk about the female characters for a bit?
Yeah, let's move on to those female characters, because there were two of them. And both very interesting, very different characters. You want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely feel like the two characters that I'm invested in are Luther and Billy. Billy is the woman who runs the brothel. It's unclear if she also is herself a prostitute. I think we would call her a madam because she's running the brothel. And she seems to be kind of in charge of a couple of things.
She's a boss. She's a boss lady.
Yeah, she's the boss.
She's a boss
exactly.
lady.
I honestly, when she first showed up, I thought she was the landlord. Because Paul Newman is like living in the building that she runs.
Well, he's working for her, I think, and he gets room and board. Yeah,
she's a woman with a lot of agency because she owns her own business, and she's definitely like standing toe to toe with Paul Newman's character, and she's clever enough to have this speakeasy and this brothel in the back of this carousel thing, and there's no indication that any man is directly involved in her business. It's pretty much just her, and she does help them with the con, so she does get some stuff to do. Now that being said, she still doesn't really have that much dialogue, and we repeatedly see her waiting on men, picking up their beers and bringing them new beers.
Yes. And she is the classic whore with a heart. But Eileen Brennan brings so much to the role. And let me just say a little bit about her here. She was an actor, kind of a character actor, not really a lead actor, for a very long. She had a very long career. I think she was in Private Benjamin with Goldie Hawn, and that really brought her to prominence. I mean, she'd been kind of a character actor up until then. However, she was in a horrific car accident in 1982. She was hit by a car in Venice Beach. I think she was walking and hit by a car. She suffered massive injuries. It took years of work for her to be able to walk and talk again. She became addicted to painkillers because of it. I think she had to have plastic surgery on her face, so she looked different. And she still managed to get work after all of that. She was mostly theater work. She worked in 1989 production of Annie. Then the following year, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Her career was not handed to her on a silver platter. She really worked very hard and overcame a lot of things, and actually lived up until 2013 when she finally did succumb to bladder cancer but she was 80 at that point. So she lived a long life despite having these terrible things happen to her. And I just really loved her take charge attitude in this film. I mean, she is waiting on men, but she is watching every minute. She uses the opportunity to wait on them when she brings the beers, to observe what's going on. She's really smart at her job. She keeps the women, her employees, safe. And in fact, at one point she says to him, "Hey, I'm going to let the women go on the round. We don't really have a lot of customers right now. We're not busy and they need a break."
That was my favorite shot, when you just have all of these women in their beautiful dresses on the carousel.
Yeah, and they're waving and they're going around and around. And these are women who make their living, having sex with men. And she gives them this time to recover and recuperate, because that cannot be an easy job. And she knows it. I just think she's a great character. She's probably my favorite character in the movie. Well, we talked about this right before we started recording.
Yeah.
I said, "Who's your favorite character?" And your immediate response was Billy. Yeah,
Billy,
my
yeah,
favorite.
for sure. I mean, there were multiple moments in the movie where I was like, I would honestly much rather be watching a movie about Billy running her like prostitute and carousel business. Like, this is kind of the most interesting detail in the film, and I would sort of prefer to be watching something about this instead.
Yeah, she's very good. And now the other woman character, and did you write her name down? Well, it's Solari or something, right?
Her fake name is Loretta, like what he
That's
calls
it,
her is
Loretta. He calls her Loretta. So, she is a woman who comes
Celino. It's Celino.
Okay, so she comes in suddenly to work in the diner where he has breakfast and lunch every day, and he being Robert Redford, and he strikes up conversation with her because he suddenly notices there's a woman behind the bar doing the short order cooking and order taking and all that, and he's interested in her. She's not particularly attractive, I thought, but still she's interesting enough to him that he starts talking to her. And over the course of 2 days has enough conversations with her that he goes to her room where they have sex. And then the next morning she's gone and he gets up and leaves. And we know at this point that a professional hitman has been sent to kill him. We don't know who it is. We just know the name and we've seen the gloved hands. And we think the gloved hands are the hitman. But it turns out that she's the hitman. She didn't kill him in the room, and he asked that question, why didn't she just kill me then? I forget what the answer was. Do you remember what the answer was?
Too many people had seen him go into her room.
So she waits, she leaves, gets up early and leaves, even though it's her room. She leaves, and then the guy who's gloved hand we've been seeing shows up and he starts following Hooker, and we think he's going to shoot Hooker, but instead Loretta comes around the corner. She's smiling at Hooker, and just as she pulls out the gun to shoot him, and both of them have guns with silencers on them, so it's just as she pulls it out, the guy behind him pulls his gun out, shoots and kills her, and Hooker turns around and says, "Who are you?" I mean, it's a horrible scene, and yet it's kind of humorous too. The expression on his face, because and it's turning the tables on the audience too, because we think that she's the good guy and he's the bad guy, and he actually turned out to be the protective detail.
And I do think that's very much a play on gender expectations. I think audiences at the time would have not assumed that a woman could have been, because we know that a hitman is after him because we hear or we see Lonigan like order it. Basically, we see Lonigan say like, "I want to put like my best hitman on it, get Celino." So our assumption is that that's going to be a man. And so the twist here is that it's actually a woman. This is a twist that you see kind of over and over again. To the point
I was just gonna say, it's a recurring theme in a lot of like James Bond type movies where the hitman, the bad the bad guy that you didn't know was a bad guy actually is a woman. And I have to wonder if this isn't where that started, that tradition, that the gender thing.
I think it's actually a much older trope than that. I think this comes from like noir films.
Okay.
I don't want to spoil other films, but this is also a twist in a number of like Hitchcock films. And,
yes, that's true. That's true. Okay.
A lot of, I mean, that's kind of the whole concept of the femme fatale, right? Is like a lot of the times the femme fatale, you don't know she's the femme fatale until the end. She just seems like a beautiful woman in distress, but it turns out that actually she's got a gun in her purse.
Right.
So it's the kind of old trope that it's been a twist so many times that now the twist is a cliche.
And of course, a third woman is Luther's wife, who we only see in 2 scenes. One where she's kind of talking flirtatiously with Hooker, and they are clearly old friends. And then the second time when she's crying and screaming over Luther's body. So, and she's an interesting character that we don't know enough about.
At the very end, when they win their $500,000 from Lonigan, Robert Redford's Hooker refuses his half, and I just immediately thought, give it to Luther's wife. What are you doing?
I assume that's where his money will go. They don't say that, and they should have.
That's not the implication. The implication is that he just doesn't take it.
He doesn't take it, but also Paul Newman's character is also friends with Luther's family. So I'm assuming some money will go to them, but they should have said it.
They should have said
what is the harm in saying this? Send my portion to Luther's family.
Because they don't actually care about Luther as a character.
Yeah,
they used him as a prop, and then they moved on. So they didn't even add a line at the end saying that they were going to take care of his widow.
Yeah.
And his children,
Yeah.
by the way, because it wasn't just his
He had
widow.
children.
Like, they also
Yeah.
had 2 kids.
Yeah. And he had grown children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
But yeah, his whole family. Anyway, I do think it's a story about loyalty and trust and who's the bad guy, who's the, can we ever really differentiate between the good guys and the bad guys when the good guys are also doing smaller versions of the things that the bad guys do. So, are you ready for hot takes, or do you have any?
Okay, I do have kind of a silly hot take, I guess.
Okay.
I found it hilarious every time someone said Hooker's name, because I have watched True Blood, and there is a character in True Blood named Lafayette who calls all of his female friends Hooker. And so anytime someone said something like, "Oh, way to go, Hooker," in my mind they were saying, "Way to go, slut." So I just I know it's a name, and I know at the time it probably sounded like a cool name. It's just that because I don't really hear it used as a name in movies anymore. I don't know if that's just sort of trends come and go. I think it used to be because there was that cop show starring
T.J. Hooker.
James Kirk.
I was going to bring that up. Yeah.
T.J. Hooker. But that was a while ago at this point, and I don't think it gets used as a name very much. I think its main cultural meaning now is prostitute, basically, or the way that Lafayette is using it is kind of more friendly. It's sort of a the way a lot of young women call their friends euphemisms for prostitute in sort of a friendly way.
Well, and every time I heard it, I thought of T.J. Hooker. It was constantly, and I never even watched the show, but I knew that that it was a big popular show in the 80s. But also, here was their opportunity to give us a little bit of backstory on this character. Where did he get this name? It's not his last name. Maybe it is his last name. We don't know. I do think, in my hot take, I do think it's a different kind of gangster, prohibition, depression story, one told in the early 70s when the civil rights movement had just begun to raise awareness of the rights of blacks and women. And, we've got Everybody Loves and Respects Luther, who's a black man in the 1930s. Everybody also loves and respects Billy, Eileen Brennan. She's a boss woman running a brothel and a bar and a carnival ride, and she is successful. And they are both highly respected characters by the other characters in the film. I think that was a move forward. It wasn't a very good move forward. I think you make valid points about how they failed. But it was a move in the right direction. They were trying. And that's kind of what the films in the 70s were doing, was transitional time in American history. Civil rights movement was basically in the 60s, winding down in the early 70s. That started to wind down after King was killed. But things were put in place to prevent discrimination. There were laws that were passed, and they started to be enforced. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was hugely impactful in the work she did to help women get financial security, to be able to have credit cards, to be able to have checking accounts, so that women who were in abusive marriages could leave. So she did that. We were just talking about this the other day, another friend of mine and I. Those things were beginning to happen. It took a ridiculously long time for these things to happen, and in some ways the changes that should have happened, and those that have are being reversed. So we're still in that transition to a better world, but I did see hints of it in this film.
Like I said, I do think their heart is in the right place. I just think we as white people need to understand that there can be no solidarity if we always have to put ourselves first.
And another question that they really don't overtly raise, but that is kind of implied, is it's set in the Depression. It's set in a time when people were starving to death, when lives were hard scrabble, when the only way some people could make a living was by stealing and grifting and running cons. Yeah. This was a very, very difficult time in our history. I mean, my mother was a child during the Depression. She was born in 1935. And this film, by the way, is set in 1936. And she, even into the early 40s, there were many days when there wasn't enough food on the table for 5 kids. I have a photograph of my family, of her parents and her siblings, sitting on the steps in the summer. It's hot. They're sitting outside. There's no air conditioning. Probably may not even have been a lot of times when they had electricity, because they couldn't pay for it. So they were sitting outside. It's like a dingy old cabin. It looks like it's about to fall down. They're all sitting out in the porch, and it's a portrait of poverty. That's what most Americans were living with. Who weren't living that way. The people like Lonigan. He kind of represents the upper class of America, which was, except for the few famous examples of people losing their fortunes and jumping out windows, the wealthy were still wealthy. It's an anti-capitalist film in some ways. It's not overt, but it's there in the background. So is that it?
I think so.
That, dear listeners, is all for today. This has been Woman Inherits the Earth, a discussion podcast about women and movies from the perspective of a mother and daughter.
I'm Tessa Dare. You can find me at my website, tessadare.com. That's TESSADAIR.com. Or you can follow me on Threads at author.tess.adair. If you would like to support us, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/womaninheritstheearth. If you're watching us on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe.
And I am Beth Von Barron. You can sign up for my weekly Substack, Saturday Morning Musings, at stlwriterbeth.substack.com. I'm also on Instagram and Threads at stl_writer_Beth, and on Blue Sky at stlwriterbeth.bsky.social. Thank you for listening. Please join us again in about 2 weeks.